We're now going to move on to our panel discussion. The moderator of the panel is Ken Rendell. Ken is the founder and director of the Museum of World War II, Boston. This is one of the best-kept secrets in Boston's cultural landscape, a condition that I hope will soon cease. I got to visit the museum for the first time just a month ago, and what a great treat it was. The museum houses the world's most comprehensive collection of World War II materials, containing 10,000 artifacts, 500,000 photographs and documents, 3,500 posters, and 7,500 reference books. Mr. Rendell began his collection in 1959, and for decades was virtually the only one pursuing World War II artifacts. He is an internationally recognized dealer of historical documents, and his clients include the Library of Congress, the National Archives, Bill Gates, Queen Elizabeth II, Armand Hammer, the Kennedy family, several US presidents, and numerous universities and museums. Not a shabby collection. He has been cited in the magazines Newsweek and Time and newspapers worldwide, and was awarded the US Justice Department's Distinguished Service Award. Mr. Rendell has authored several books, including his most recent volume, Politics, War, and Personality, 50 iconic World War II documents that changed the world. Ken?
I'd like to ask our panelists to come up. Izzy Arbeiter, a Holocaust survivor. Kerry Dunne, who is the Director of History and Social Studies in the Boston Public School System. Paul Reid, the very successful author of The Last Lion, Winston Spencer Churchill, Defender of the Realm. And Susan Wilkins, who teaches history and science, social sciences in the Newton Public School System. The mission of the Museum of World War II is to utilize our unique collection as access points to engage students in thinking about the essential questions and themes of the period 1919 to 1945, and to help them understand the relevancy to their own lives. The museum is not just a memorial. It is not static. We want students and visitors to experience the exhibits, not to just look at them. The subtitle of the museum is The Causes and Consequences of War. War is personal, war is complex, and despite the hopes of good people, war is always with us. The museum is the only one in the world that treats World War II as a global event, something I find quite amazing. Every country is represented in the museum by comprehensive collections of artifacts and documents representing the human story in the social, political, and military context. Doris Kearns Goodwin, one of our founding trustees, who wrote our mission statement, wrote that the museum exhibits the mosaic of life in every area. There are over 7,000 artifacts on display. There are 500,000 pieces in the archives. The Imperial War Museum in London describes it as the most comprehensive display of original World War II artifacts anywhere. The breadth and intimacy of the collection, with its interrelationships between leaders and soldiers, good and evil, the battlefront and the home front, drama and despair, lends itself to an interdisciplinary approach. On any level, the educational experience can meet students where they are in their lives and encourage them to view the human experience as broader than any one individual or any one time in history. The original objects in this collection, with few exceptions, can be touched and handled. Students and educators are encouraged to feel the immediacy of these years. There are many themes to which students can relate. Conformity in Nazi Germany, in the sense of in the pressure to belong to the crowd, which can be interpreted these days in bullying. The difficulty in recognizing evil when it is marketed with nationalistic and economic benefits. The complexity of human nature, the loneliness of leadership, the strength of comradeship and friendship, the power of propaganda developed during the rise of Nazism, the power of nationalism, the importance of leadership, individuals, patriotism, courage, and fortitude. I've always believed that students can learn one of the most important lessons in life by realizing how leaders focused on what they could do and not what they couldn't do. George Patton had very severe learning problems, probably dyslexia, in an age when nobody recognized dyslexia. Winston Churchill had severe problems with depression. Eisenhower came from a dirt poor immigrant family in Kansas. And Franklin Roosevelt ran the country in America's war from a wheelchair. These examples are not lost on the students who visit the museum, each of whom is required to fill out a questionnaire before they leave. One of them wrote, quote, "My time at the museum really humbled my own struggles in my life." The museum has given grants to the Concord River Institute to create programs that can be sent to teachers in advance, and then they can use any of the many, many different varieties in this program when they're in the museum and afterwards. One of the programs, the initial one that they developed, was called America Enters the War, Exploring the Four Freedoms. And they include in that rounding up Japanese Americans and all of the other really complex aspects of that subject. And the rise of Nazism, which is certainly one of the most complex. And we present that in a way that students and visitors can focus on different aspects of the rise and success of Nazism. Marshall Carter, who is currently principal at Milton Academy, is leaving there at the end of the school year to be our director of education starting in September. Marshall is here someplace. Our other major development in terms of education is that in September, one of the most brilliant minds in museum education will be leaving as deputy director of a major European museum to become our director. In the foreword to a book she wrote on the subject, which was called Their Past, Your Future, she concluded, quote, "History is about who we, humanity, were then and who we are now. Without knowing something about the former, our understanding of the present, of what we might be capable of, either individually or as a society, is so much weaker. In learning history, we are not learning how to predict the future, neither are we learning lessons from it that can be directly applied to the choices and the dilemmas that confront us today. In encountering real people, whether as veterans or eyewitnesses to events, we are encouraging young people to understand history as the accumulation of the conduct, choices, and the luck of many, many people. We are arming ourselves with a greater depth of understanding about how individual people, communities, or states behave at times of enormous stress or adversity. And in contemplating how we might respond in similar circumstances, we are surely equipping ourselves with a greater emotional intelligence and resilience to stand up to difficult times. These seem good reasons to teach the lessons of and learn about war, and to treat history and the people whose testimony forms some part of that history with respect. That articulation of her observations over a 20-year period are exactly what the museum's education mission is all about. I'm going to turn to our panel, each of whom is going to give their ideas on what they're doing, and then we will get on to some general questions. I think we'll start alphabetically with Izzy Arbeiter.
Thank you very much, Ken. Thanks for the nice introduction. And I want to thank very much the Pioneer Institute for inviting me here. It's a great honor for me to stay here and spend the morning and speak with you about the point of the day and a part of it, my individual life story as a Holocaust survivor. My name is Izzy Arbeiter. 70 years ago, I was a prisoner in Auschwitz. 4 months ago, I was invited by the President of the United States to serve on the presidential delegation for the 70th anniversary of the camp's liberation. I went, and I stood in front of the same gate that I had entered as a teenager. I was born in Plock, a city in Poland, with a thriving Jewish community. My father was a tailor. My mother was a housewife who cared for my 4 brothers and me. When Hitler came to power in Germany, my father did not believe that German people would follow him. But in 1939, Germany occupied Poland and forced all the Jews to wear yellow stars. After arriving in my town, then evicted all the Jews out of their homes, sent us to ghettos, and then to forced labor camps in the Polish city of Starachowice. At the age of 14, I became a slave laborer, condemned to death for the only crime I have committed because I was born Jewish. We were mistreated and beaten regularly. When I contracted typhus, I was sent to an infirmary. On my second night there were 87 people in that infirmary that were sick with typhus. On the second night there, all 87 of the patients were to be taken outside to be shot, because if you were sick, if you weren't able to work, you had no right to live. You were executed. There were 87, like I mentioned, 87 people in that infirmary. Out of the 87, that night, 86 were shot by the camp commandant Althoff and the chief of the Gestapo, Walter Becker. Only one escaped, came out alive. I will give you a little quiz. Who do you think that one person was that escaped? Yes, it was me. I escaped by jumping out of a window and hiding in a ditch. In October 1942, all the Jews in Starachowice labor camp were gathered for a selection. 2 of my brothers and I were directed to one line, my parents and my youngest brother to another. I had never been separated from my parents, and so I ran over where they were selected. But my father understood what was happening and sent me back to the other line. The last thing he said to me, go back over there, and if you survive, remember to carry on with Jewish life and Jewish tradition. He, my father, my brother, my mother, and my 7-year-old brother, Yosef, were sent directly to the death camp of Treblinka, where they were gassed and incinerated the same day. That was and still is the darkest day of my life, because I've never seen my parents since then. From the moment we were separated, I knew that if I survived, I will do all in my power to fulfill my father's wishes. I spent the next 2.5 years in Camp Starachowice before being shipped to Auschwitz and then to 4 other slave labor camps. We were starved, subject to killing, forced marches, beaten, terrorized, and degraded in every way possible. Yet, some of us managed to survive. By April 1945, I knew that our luck ran out. We were on a dead march, which was to be end in abandoned salt mines, where we would all be executed. Instead, on my 20th birthday, our guards fled and the French army appeared. After 5.5 years, I was finally free. You can't really understand what it means to be free until your freedom is taken away from you. It is oxygen to human soul. So we all must learn to live our freedom, care for it, and protect it. This is why, for 70 years, I have devoted my life to teaching about the Holocaust. I have spoken to school children, before congressional committees, at universities, and even in audiences in Germany and in Poland, to ensure that people understand and do not forget. Here in Boston, we have created a beautiful Holocaust memorial. We had ceremonies every year, created contests, and established a museum, including a small one that uses my name, and it's now located at the Gen Academy in Waltham. I am proud of what we have been able to achieve. Yet, I need to tell you that I'm also worried. In our world, there are people and movements that care nothing for human life and have no respect for freedom. Even 10 years ago, I did not imagine that things that are happening today would be possible. So I put my hope in the beautiful young people who listen and want to learn about what happened so that they can protect our future. I am now 90 years old. I think about my life. I feel that my best to keep my promises to my father. I also did my best to pass on to my children and grandchildren a world where hate and intolerance that I knew would no longer be possible. In this, I did not succeed, but I still hope and pray that for a world of peace for everybody. And so I say to each of you here today that this is your moment. It's up to you now to continue the struggle for freedom. It is up to you to secure all our children and grandchildren's future. It's up to you to meet the moment. We also must remember those who restored our lives, our deliberators, the young GIs, the Americans, British, French, and Russians, and other young men who joined their armies, went to war, defeated the Nazis, and liberated us from certain death. It is only sad that they didn't come a little sooner. The horrible suffering that we survivors endured in the concentration camps cannot be forgotten. The memory of the Holocaust must become part of human conscience for all time, beyond sorrow, suffering, and death. We pray and hope that peace and understanding will continue to grow out of the terrible destruction that we witnessed during the Holocaust. We pray and hope for a world blessed with peace, understanding, and goodwill for all mankind. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Izzy. You can't get any better than that.
No wonder I got such a nice ovation. I was reading Ken's but
neither one of us can read without the right glasses. So we have absolutely the same typeface. That's what got confusing. When I saw what Izzy had done, I thought, my God, that looks just like mine. Our next speaker is Kerry Dunne, the Director of History and Social Studies for the Boston Public Schools.
Thank you, Ken, and thank you, Izzy. What a memorable and touching few moments for all of us to share together, hearing his story. I'll keep my remarks brief. I was delighted and flattered to be invited to be part of the panel today for several reasons. One that hit very close to home. My grandfather, who passed away several years ago, his name was John McHugh. He was a forensic chemist, one of the first forensic chemists. It was an emerging field when he entered the practice, and he ran the Mass State Police Crime Lab. He was one of the founders of it. He was a World War II veteran who was a flight navigator and flight meteorologist in the Army Air Corps, serving in the Pacific Front, including in the Battle of Okinawa. He later was called back. He stayed in the reserves and assisted in the Berlin airlift. I was fortunate to have my grandfather in my life, and even more fortunate that I was an early student of history and knew enough to conduct some oral histories of my grandfather about his experiences and his memories, and I use them with my own students, and they're still some of my fondest moments as a teacher. They ranged from the amusing. He, right after Pearl Harbor, walked out of his classes at Tufts to volunteer. He was a tall, skinny guy. He needed to eat about 4 pounds of bananas to make the minimum weight threshold. So he walked down to the corner store, bought bananas, came back, weighed in again, and enlisted. And then to the harrowing, he remembers being so hot that it was just literally impossible to sleep in the Pacific on the ships. So he and his fellow sailors would sleep on the deck and tie ropes to their ankles to something that was immovable on the ship, so that if the waves tossed them during the night, they had deep fear of being thrown overboard or rolled overboard. And then to the shocking, in Okinawa, he was part of a group of American troops who encountered comfort women who had been held from China and Korea by Japanese troops there, and had unearthed that history, and then later on he sought to preserve that history. Another troubling chapter of this war. It was mentioned by Professor Kennedy and Mr. Atkinson that there might only be 1 million left of our servicemen. It's essential that we get the stories of people like my grandfather while they are still with us, and the many more who maybe didn't serve in the war as soldiers but were children during that time, or women on the home front, or lived abroad in other parts of the world deeply impacted by this war. There's still time, and it's essential for us all to take on part of that mission and preserve that history and preserve their stories for future generations. And I'd like to end with just a note in response to Tom Birmingham's eloquent remarks. He brought up the fight for U.S. history and the MCAS, and that's very relevant to us here. But we're in a bigger fight. We're in a bigger fight to preserve the study of history and social studies at all in our schools right now. We live in an era where, unfortunately, appreciation for history, for the lessons of one's past, for the values of Americans being informed and active citizenry, for academics and knowledge at all, are under threat in our country from many, many angles. And the Federal Department of Education, with the end of the Teaching American History grant, has all but defunded history and social studies education. Our own state has a law mandating the teaching of U.S. history and civics that is not enforced, not even monitored by our state's DESE. This is a tough time, folks, and we need all of us to put history and social studies back on the front burner for many reasons, to preserve the stories of our past and to build a brighter future for our students. Thank you.
Paul Reid is the author of the very well acclaimed biography of Winston Churchill. Paul. Thank you.
Thank you, Ken and Jason and all the folks from the Pioneer Institute. It's been an honor to, well, it is an honor to be asked up here. I'm a native Bostonian, but I haven't been back in town very much for the last 20 years. And it's great to be home. I was appalled to hear about the change in Massachusetts school curricula, that history, civics no longer required or no longer tested or both. I'm not a teacher, but I wouldn't be here today if not for the teachers I had back in Winchester, Mass. 25 or so years ago. My sixth grade teacher was George Farman, Captain George Farnham, fought in World War II. My dentist, Larry Quigley, was Captain Larry Quigley, Marine. My old man, Sam Reid, went to the Naval Academy in the late 30s. My uncle Robbie, Henry Robinson, enlisted in the Marines at 17 and was 18 barely when he was fighting on Iwo Jima. These are the people that I grew up with and heard stories, and history came to me as a little tiny kid, and I loved history. But it was certainly, that love was nurtured in my own house by my parents, by my sixth grade teacher and my 10th grade English teacher, Jim Case. And in fact, I mentioned a few of those folks in the author's note to The Last Lion and thanked them. A couple of them are still alive and helped proofread the book. And in thinking about speaking here briefly today, you know, and it's already been said, but I'll say it again, we have to inculcate in students a love of history, a curiosity. You guys, the teachers, have to bring it alive and make it come alive. And, you know, looking back to the classrooms I was in, there were discussions. We were challenged. And we had books to read beyond textbooks. Now, I'm sure the Diary of Anne Frank is still assigned in classrooms across the country, but I'd love to see books like Tim O'Brien's The Things We Carried assigned, William Styron's Sophie's Choice. Professor Eugene Sledge was a U.S. Marine in the Pacific, fought on Okinawa. His memoir, With the Old Breed, cannot be topped. And, you know, you on the English side of the classroom, if you will, you've got to have those teachers getting children to love to read, and then in the history classrooms, you got to put them to work reading. And I just couldn't have imagined growing up, thinking back now. I mean, my pile of books next to my bed at the youngest of ages was biographies of Churchill and Hitler and history. And there's an older historian out on the West Coast named James Humes, and he was a young man 70 years ago or so when he met Churchill, and he asked, what should I carry with me in the coming years? And Churchill said, study history, study history, study history. And that was coming from a man who made his living writing history. And it's, again, sad if the state of education history in Massachusetts is what it is now. But it's pretty much nationwide, I think. About 15 years ago, on Washington's birthday, I did a feature story. It was at a newspaper at the time. And I had read about a New Jersey businessman who was willing to have framed the old Gilbert portraits of George Washington that I had in every school I attended as a kid, up, over the blackboard. And he offered these to all of the schools in New Jersey, thousands of schools, public schools, free, because they had been removed over the decades. And he had about 4 takers out of all the schools in New Jersey. And I remember doing the story and calling my friend William Manchester, who's a historian, and he was appalled, and his concern was for the next generation. How can they be good citizens? How can they be informed? I mean, the old cliche, if you don't know your history, you're going to repeat it, is so true. So I'm so proud and thankful that you guys invited me here and that I can join this company and get to hear Rick Atkinson, one of my favorite authors, and Professor Kennedy. But the job is going to be done by us in our homes first, with our kids and grandchildren when that day comes, and then in the schools, and the results will obtain or they won't. And if they don't, then I'm glad I won't be here 30 or 40 years from now. So thank you very much.
I have to add one book to what Paul just said, and his co-author, William Manchester, wrote a book called Goodbye Darkness. And if you're really looking to understand World War II service in a similar way to what you might experience, because he was a very educated guy who joins the Marines, and he wrote an unbelievable memoir about trying to get away from the nightmares as to what happened. Our next speaker is in the Newton School Systems, Susan Wilkins.
Thank you. It's just how my students greet me every day. So first of all, thank you so much to the Pioneer Institute for inviting me, and I'm sure if we could contact my students, they would also say thank you for pulling me away from school this morning. I teach at Newton North, and I think I'm here to lend some perspective as to the challenges that classroom teachers face in dealing with such an important and vast topic. In Newton, students learn about World War II in both the sophomore and junior year history classes. Sophomore year course focuses more on the European context, and the junior year, of course, is U.S. history, so greater attention is given to the Pacific theater and home front changes that year. In dealing with complex historical topics like World War II, I think the challenges for classroom history teachers are twofold. First, we face the perennial issue of breadth versus depth. We teach survey courses, and I think it's very important that we teach survey courses For the vast majority of American high school students, their junior year history course will be the last history course they take, ever. It is important that we cover the scope of U.S. history in its entirety. That, of course, means we have to limit how much time we can devote to any topic. We need to construct an accurate and clear narrative for students, and then pick a few historical moments to explore in greater depth. And I suspect that's where we might have some discussion as to what those moments should be. But secondly, in addition to teaching the history itself, we also want to teach students to think like historians and to do the work of historians. This involves having students work with both primary and secondary sources, to engage in analytical research and writing, as well as to understand that history is often complex and nuanced, more gray than black and white, and that debate exists and that not all interpretations are equally valid. So with that said, and in response to Mr. Birmingham's early statistics about sort of the state of history in the Commonwealth, I think in Newton we do a very good job, both of conveying the narrative and of challenging students to grapple with the more complex issues and debates surrounding this topic. Thank you.
Thank you, Sue. We're going to get on to some questions for general discussion among the panel. Sue just covered some of them from her perspective at Newton North. The first question that I would ask the panel is that the subject of World War II is as complex as the war itself. What are the lessons and knowledge you believe students should learn from this era? I'll start with you.
There are two that I think would be large takeaways that I would want to see every student studying World War II leave the classroom with. Of course, we want students to form their own opinions and their own judgments, but I would certainly hope that the dangers of isolationism would be apparent to a student of World War II. And I would hope, too, that teachers would be mindful of that and model that by making sure their own students are informed about the conflicts occurring around our world today and the threats occurring around our complicated world today. There are excellent resources out there. The New York Times Up Front is a terrific news magazine for students. So I think creating that parallel between why it was important for the United States and its leaders of the pre-World War II and World War II era to be informed and active members of a world society, and why you, as a student in my U.S. history class, need to be an active and informed member of our country's society and our broader world society is an important lesson, I think. I also think, and this is something that our partner in the Boston Public Schools, Facing History and Ourselves, has been very effective in helping deliver this message, the understanding that the persecution of minority groups often creates a political climate that leads to totalitarianism, fascism, Nazism. We have deep threats in our world today around the persecution of minority groups in Europe, in the Middle East, elsewhere. I'm wearing my Forget-Me-Not badge. I see somebody else in the audience wearing theirs in celebration, or remembrance, not celebration, remembrance of the 100th anniversary of the Armenian Genocide. This is a recurring theme in world history, and it's one that our students need to be mindful of and watchful of today. So those would be enduring lessons I would like to see our students depart from a study of World War II with. And I think it's one that our teachers, skilled, certified teachers of history, can help impart.
Thank you, Kerry. Please just jump in.
Okay, well, I would say, first of all, in the 10th grade course, the narrative in my class is what explains the rise of Hitler and the Nazi Party in Weimar, Germany. I think this is a very complex issue, and students, I find, don't have much knowledge about this at all. And I want students to understand this happened in part because of internal problems within the Weimar Republic and this new experiment with democracy in Germany, And I want them to understand what Hitler and the Nazi Party did to attract voters to their party. In 10th grade courses is also where we teach the Holocaust. And here I want students to understand both sort of the history of anti-Semitism and how it changed under the Nazi regime. There's a wonderful, very short, sort of 5-minute YouTube clip by Rabbi Sachs who talks about the evolution of anti-Semitism and the sort of innovation of racial anti-Semitism under the Nazi regime. I also find that 10th grade students really have trouble understanding why the Jews didn't get out. You know, why didn't they leave and go someplace safer? And this is something I've really grappled with, trying to educate them about. And we sort of look at a timeline of Nazi anti-Semitic acts, and you know, I sort of turn it back on them. Well, when do you think it would, you know, too much has happened where you feel, you know, you would need to get out, and where do you think you would go? And then finally, we look at the escalation beginning in 1939 and sort of the industrial, technological nature of the Nazi extermination plan. And then I would just say in the 11th grade U.S. history class, again, the focus is obviously a little bit different. Here I'm looking, I want my students to understand this, the war really lays to rest this ongoing debate in U.S. history between isolationism and interventionism, and you know, that began with Washington's farewell address, and World War II really ends that debate. And obviously, this is the year we give attention to, you know, Pearl Harbor, the U.S. role in the European theater. The U.S. in the Pacific is looked at in quite a bit of detail, culminating with the decision to drop the atomic bomb.
Thank you, Sue. It's very, I'm going to jump in here for a moment also because while you're teaching anti-Semitism right from the beginning, what we do in the museum is we begin with Hitler's first anti-Semitic rant, which is written on the announcement the Versailles Treaty has been signed, and Hitler wrote on this is June 1919, this means the Jews are going to take over Germany, we have to drive the Jews out of Germany. But it begins in print in really small ways. On notices of meetings in the beer halls, it says at the bottom, no Jews allowed. And then the next year, the Nazi Party program comes out, and it's just 2 lines. The Jews cannot be citizens of Germany, and that's it. Then we have signs, Jews can't sit on park benches. And it keeps escalating. The Jews are not allowed in this town. And so you have a 20-year period where I think people adjusted to anti-Semitism. So the next year, when it's a little more restrictive, well, you're already accepting it up to that point. And then 1939, Hitler gives the annihilation of the Jews speech. And we have the manuscript of that. So we take it, 1939 is the rise of anti-Semitism. And then we begin the Holocaust really with the annihilation speech. And then we get into concentration camps. So we parallel with what you're doing. Izzy, did you?
Thank you, Ken. Are we going to be served lunch and dinner here? Because you
wait. If there isn't enough time, Izzy speaks at our museum frequently, so we can invite all of you to a full-scale talk by Izzy. He is one of the great speakers that we have at our museum.
Thank you, Ken. I used to speak in schools. That was my favorite place. I got a lot of invitations for speaking engagements in synagogues and churches and military installations. But I always picked the schools because the young people, especially the junior and in high schools, junior and senior class, they are going to be the future leaders of the world. And to them, we got to install and tell them and teach them and explain to them what was happening during World War II. I myself was a youngster during World War II. I was 14 years old when World War II broke out. I spent most of the time in being imprisoned in concentration camps, and including in Auschwitz, which, if I were to go on the subject about telling you about Auschwitz, like I said, we would have to serve us here lunch and dinner. But the main subject that I try to speak to students in schools is what happened to a peaceful country, to a country of intelligent people. In the heart of Europe, in the 20th century, not in the wilderness of Africa, not in the jungles of Asia, but in the heart of Europe, that one or a small group of Nazi criminals could convince a nation of what it was probably at about 80 million people to become murderers, to become torturers, to commit such crimes that it is unbelievable. And let me say this, if anybody walks out from here and say, I don't believe a word what Izzy was saying, because it is impossible to believe that what we lived through under the Nazis.
Izzy, would you speak for a minute? Because Izzy speaks in German schools. And I'm very interested in what reaction you get when you're speaking to a school in Germany. I mean, it seems to me that Germany really has confronted its past. Japan, we have a problem in this country with not teaching history. Japan teaches a very different version of history. But Germany seems to be doing a very thorough job, and I know that you have a lot of experience speaking in these schools.
I've been invited the last 7 years to come to speak in Germany in schools. And the audience, the high school students especially, it's called the Gymnasium, before they go to college, are very interested in the history of what their parents, their great-parents, did during the war. I notice in the audience when I tell them and ask them the same questions, and I can see tears pouring from the eyes of the students in disbelief that their nice people, nice parents, committed such atrocities. Mm-hmm. I had testified at a trial in a city called Traunstein of a Nazi, of a criminal that committed atrocities in one of the concentration camps. And I was testifying against him. Mm-hmm. During the intermission, and there was intermission, I was trying to get from the hall where the process took place to the men's room. And a young man approached me and he says, Mr. Arbeiter, excuse me, can I speak to you? I says, of course you can. And he says, I'm there every day during the trial to listen. I'm a Holocaust student. I learn a lot about the Holocaust, and I believe everything that you were saying, what happened to you. But one mistake you're making, the man that is sitting there is not the one that committed those atrocities. He's a good man. He's my father. He's a good father. He's a good husband. And I says, it's very possible that he's a good man and he's a good father. But during the war, he was a mean person. He was a murderer. He was killing innocent people, children, babies. So this is the man that's sitting there. And the young people in the audience want to know. They ask such important questions because they want to know. There is a big difference between the elder generation and the young people. The elder generation says, it's enough, we talked about it, it's happened a long time ago, why don't we stop about it, let's move on. The young people, and why is it now, as Ken mentioned, now more open in a greater demand in Germany? Because the young people want to know. They want to know, they want to learn, they want to know what happened in Germany. They want to know answers to the questions that we are asking. How can a civilized nation like that become murderers, committed unbelievable atrocities? And this is what we're also speaking in schools here, because the young people here want to know. And again, like I said, they're going to be the future leaders. And they will know from what they learn from us. If they don't learn from us, they won't know what happened. But from us, they learn. They can carry it on. And again, there is a great interest, a great demand for Holocaust survivors. I know there is a representative here from Facing History. I spoke on many occasions for Facing History to students, to schools. And again, we did make, 2 years ago, I made a documentary, a movie in Poland and in Germany, and it's called I Promised to My Father. It was from the question that I said before, that when my father sent me over to the other line after the selection, they were sent to the death camp in Treblinka and murdered there. And my father said, if you survive, remember to carry on with Jewish life and Jewish tradition. And this was with me every day of my life during the imprisonment and concentration camps, and even after then. And I've been doing this for the past 65 years, since I arrived in the United States.
I just wanted to add, in terms of people asking how could all of this happen, we try to show that in the museum with pageantry, the music, all of the things that people did get caught up in. It was marketing a war. And the common denominator in all of Hitler's speeches was anti-Semitism. That, I mean, the lack of the loss of nationalism, the humiliation of World War I and Versailles, the economy. These are all the problems affecting people every day. And the punchline in every Hitler speech is, it's because of the Jews. But people getting caught up in that pageantry, the colors, the design, the propaganda, it was an incredible feat of marketing a war. I want to change our focus a little bit for a minute here. Many textbooks, and I saw this with my daughter going to school, stress social movements over leadership. The Russians learned disastrously that by not having any specific leaders in the military, they were losing, they were getting decimated by Germany, and then Zhukov argued for putting back officers and leaders, and the Russians came together. Churchill, for example, or specifically, I understand, is not taught in British schools now. And Paul, you're in a perfect position to comment. I mean, this whole thing our interpretation is that it's leaders and people. It's both. You can't have one without the other. But Paul, what do you run into with this?
I am an unabashed, unapologetic, great man theory of history historian. And so to not teach Churchill or Stalin or Roosevelt or Lincoln or George Washington, and not only not teach, but not put them into a context. That's what I think the history student who leaves the classroom not with the chronological facts and the dates and the number of chapters or in a certain book, but goes home thinking. And the first line of defense there is going to be, or the first line of offense is the teacher, for sure. But if the teacher has textbooks that are horribly politically incorrect or revised, it just isn't going to happen. And I've heard Izzy say, and other folks today, and it's an old saw, that these students are our next generation of leaders. No, and I'm not being cynical, if they're not imbued with a love and a respect of history, they're the next generation of sheep. And from a classroom somewhere, there may be a leader, but if they are not aware of Churchill, going to the case you're mentioning in Great Britain, then how can they take away that feeling of how heroic the stance of the English people was during 1940 and 41? So again, if the great men and women are not being taught, there's something wrong. And I'd add one thing, and that is, Professor Kennedy was talking about history and what ifs, and that's always fun to do. But there is a sense of teaching kids contingencies in the dictionary sense of the word, of events that could happen and do, or might not happen and do not. And we want to put history into order, chronological, and this happened and this happened and this happened, but it's a mess. It's a kaleidoscopic mess as it's being born, if you will, history. And that sense of contingencies that, and it's not a what if, it actually happened. What now were the repercussions, the fallout, as we'd say, after growing up in the 50s. So again, I haven't been in a classroom in a long time. I'd like to think of the visual aids and museum visits and artifacts that, especially for the grade school children, can just work magic. Finally, I have at home every Time magazine published during World War II. They belonged to Bill Manchester's mother. She got them in Oklahoma City. So what is that, 6 or so years times 52 weeks? That's one of the reasons the book took me 9 years. I just couldn't stop reading those Time magazines. Now, half the reportage was wrong, but that's part of the story. And I was like a kid in a candy store with those Time magazines and other sources and artifacts, and meeting folks like you, Izzy, and one of my best friends is a 96-year-old retired Army major. He retired as a general. He fought as a major under Patton and led a brigade of tanks and fought in the Battle of the Bulge. Al Erzik, great man. I know not every student is going to grow up and want to be a historian, but if they just love it and grasp the relationships and the contingencies and the importance of it. If not, then we'll raise a generation of sheeps. Thanks.
That's a good way to put it.
I was just going to say, in our classrooms, I think, in getting at this issue of leadership, I think we want students to understand these leaders aren't born great leaders. They have to make difficult choices along the way, and having students understand why certain choices are made when they are made is, I think, an important intellectual exercise. And we often use the appropriately named Choices program out of the Watson Institute at Brown University, which will take some of these very sort of controversial and important moments in history and really ask students to do some research and reading to try to understand why the decisions that were made were made. And so one example that sort of comes to mind is the whole appeasement policy before the outbreak of the war. And students today look back on that and sort of say, well, what were they thinking? Why would you ever appease a person like Hitler? And it's, I think, very important to stop students and to say, look, we are talking about very intelligent people who were making these decisions. So that is a very good question. Why appeasement? And instead of just sort of brushing it off and saying, oh, they just, didn't know what they were thinking, to really delve into that and say, okay, why did they choose appeasement? Because there were sort of rational reasons for that decision at that time. So in addition to sort of highlighting sort of the roles of these great luminaries, I think it also is important to try and put students back into that time period and have them think through the issues that these leaders had to think through at that time.
I think just commenting on that, I think that appeasement was based on the fact that good people could not imagine that there could ever be another war like World War I. It was called the Great War. The losses were staggering in England and France, and they just couldn't conceive that Germany would ever do it again. And it's very hard for good people to understand evil. I want to ask a question that relates to everyone, and it's kind of combining several of the questions that we had here, is to just how, because we find this to be a fine line, and we have our own policy about exposing students to evil. And if you overwhelm people, they shut off, and they're not going to look, and you can't get to them. And we're trying to hook people into the stories and hook them into the experiences. But just how do kids in your schools today deal with the evil of the Holocaust, deal with the question of the United States working with Stalin, a person as evil as Hitler, to his own country? But it was necessary, and we do it today. I mean, if you look at all the alliances that we have with dictatorships and places with no human rights, how are kids reacting to to evil? Kerry, do you want to?
It's a tough question, and it's one where, again, I think a skilled, well-trained teacher is essential to be able to make the judgment calls about what is appropriate for which age group and what they can handle. We have a lot of teachers who've had great success using the Dyer Van Frank with middle school students, but they might hold back on some of the more disturbing images with that population and wait till the high school age to introduce that, and I think that's a reasonable judgment call. But the evil piece, it is hard, especially when you're looking at students who maybe are of the ethnic or religious background that were victimized and persecuted during World War II or during another troubling event in history. And I think there needs to be a place for them to debrief and talk about their emotions around this. But the wrong answer would be to not teach it, and the wrong answer would be to not address these chapters in our history.
Any other comments? And then we're going to go to questions from the audience.
Yeah, I think teaching the Holocaust is a difficult, very difficult topic. Not that students can't understand the history, but I think for them to empathize it's difficult. That 6 million is, unfathomable. And if there were only more Mr. Arbeiters who could come and speak every year to our classes, I think that would go a long way to help. I've tried in the past to use sources like Showing the Pianist, which I think is actually an excellent account of the escalation against Jews by the Nazi regime. I just found it was just overpowering for my students. That was a case where it was just too much. The United States Holocaust Museum has excellent online sources. One of the sites I've had, or elements of their site where I've had success with, is these individual sort of placards, sort of stories of individuals who experienced the Holocaust, and some survived and most did not. That at least puts more of a sort of singular human face to this crime and tragedy. But definitely I find that a struggle. And then as far as the Stalin piece, that I don't think is difficult for students to understand. I think they understand very, very clearly this was an alliance of necessity. They will already have learned about the Stalinist regime and rise of totalitarianism in the Soviet Union. And then, of course, we follow it by showing that this was not an alliance that lasted after the war, and in fact, the U.S. allies with Western democratic nations. So that I don't think is as troubling to students as.
Thank you. I hope we have time for a couple of questions. Yes.
Thank you. I work in basic history and ourselves, as a couple people have mentioned. I would like to first start by acknowledging Izzy, who is a beloved member of the Facing History family, and also, fortunately for us, is one of many Holocaust survivors that speak in classrooms. So if anyone is interested in finding out where our Holocaust and other witnesses to history are speaking, or interested in any of that, or any of our extensive collection of videotapes, online resources, so forth and so on, I would refer you to facinghistory.org. So for my question, I'd like to know, what can we do as ordinary business people to support the teaching of this history?
I'll answer that first. I think teaching about the Holocaust, teaching about World War II, it's complex and it's hard, and it's an area where teachers can use support. And supporting organizations like Facing History, like the United States Holocaust Museum, for sure, who do such a good job of providing training and resources to teachers, is a good place for the business community to start. I also think the business community has a powerful voice. I'd like to see them use more about the importance of teaching history at all. And it would have some impact on our legislative and political leaders in making sure that happens.
Do we have time for one more question? Yes, sir.
I have a question for Mr. Arbeiter. I've been doing some research trying to find out examples of the highest degree of courage during World War II, set by anybody. I didn't find it on the battlefield. I didn't find it among the national leaders. It was among ordinary citizens in Nazi-occupied countries who took in Jewish children or Jewish families. Same thing was with Anne Frank, okay? Under extraordinary conditions of courage and the likelihood that they would be found and either hurt themselves or their families would be punished and the Jewish kids would be killed. Somehow they did this, and they found examples all over the countries that were Nazi-occupied. And my question to you as a Holocaust survivor is, why do you think these people did that, took that risk, showed that courage?
That question can be answered with two parts. Number one, it is true that some people in some countries saved Jews that did hide them at the risk of their own lives and their families. The penalty by the Germans for catching anybody hiding Jews was very, very severe. It was either sent into a concentration camp or the death penalty. But the question is, if it was morally important to save another life, you know, it says the saying, when you save a life, you save the whole world. If it was morally important to save some lives of their neighbors, of their friends, of citizens from their country, why was there so few that did? On the other hand, were the bad people, which did hide Jews for as long as they could get paid. That either they invited Jews to hide them in their homes or whatever for being paid for whatever jewelry or whatever they can get. When the people that they're hiding didn't have any more to pay, they turned them over to the Germans. In some cases, when they took in the people, they took away from them what they possess and turned them over to the Germans. So you had two parts. It all depends in which country. The worst that was Poland. And it's quite a long story about that.
Thank you. I think that sometimes the moral alternative to not helping is worse than the possibility of what happened if you did. I mean, that's certainly something I've heard from people. I want to thank Pioneer for doing all of this. You know, I think that all of us look at the newspapers every day and the world has gone to hell. And Pioneer is really doing something against partisanship and in examining all kinds of subjects. And I think that we all owe a great debt to Pioneer Institute for what they do to help society. Thank you all.
Before we close, I have a penultimate announcement. We're just about to conclude this really high caliber event. But at the end of the event, we'll have a book/DVD signing. Izzy Arbeiter will sign his DVD, A Promise to My Father. Rick Atkinson will sign the 3 volumes of his Liberation trilogy. David Kennedy will sign his Pulitzer Prize-winning Freedom from Fear, The American People in Depression and War. Paul Reid will be signing his Winston Churchill, The Last Lion, Defender of the Realm, 1940 to 1945. And Ken Rendell will be signing his Politics, War, and Personality, 50 Iconic World War II Documents That Changed the World. This has been really a stellar event, and a lot of people are responsible for making these events work as well as they do. But there is nobody at Pioneer Institute more than Jamie Gass, who deserves credit for putting these events together. And this is in a long line of very successful events in the intelligence of everybody who participated, from the keynote speakers to the moderator to the panelists and to the very, very incisive questions and comments from the audience. I'm deeply grateful and deeply impressed. Thank you for a great morning, and I don't know what our next event is going to be, but we'll certainly let you know about it and invite you back. Thank you again.